Hello, and thank you very much for downloading the World Cup of World Cups podcast. My name's James Cook. I'm one of the co-hosts around these parts, and I'm just dropping in here to say that because of an issue with Paul's microphone, my co-host, Paul Savage, sounds like he's broadcasting from 1930. Which I suppose is sort of tonally consistent with what we're talking about. This is just to reassure you that this is the only episode where this happens, so we hope you can bear with us. I mean, you can hear what he's saying, it just sounds like he's either on a gramophone record or shouting through a megaphone in a bin. So yes, we are aware of the problem, but we hope you enjoy the podcast anyway. Here it is. It's the World Cup of World Cups, Episode 1, Uruguay 1930. July the 13th, 1930. Bobby Jones is celebrating his fourth US Open win. Sir Don Bradman has just broken the record for runs scored in an innings, and 6,000 mediums gather at the Albert Hall to try and contact Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's ghost. Meanwhile, in Montevideo, it's all kicking off. It's a World Cup that only exists on paper.
Love the idea of a load of French and Belgians going up, up, up.
14 years later, he was shot by a firing squad.
Bloody hell. You'd not get away with that in Daily Mail in the 70s.
I reckon the 300 people at Romania, Peru were all time travellers. Yeah.
Ben Miller, 65,000. Da, 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 da.
As the most popular song of 1930, the Stein Song by Rudy Valli and his orchestra, fades away, we welcome you to the first episode of the World Cup of World Cups. I'm James Cook.
And I am Paul Savage.
And we are doing a deep dive into every FIFA Men's World Cup there has ever been in order to work out which of the World Cups was the best.
Yeah, it's going to be a World Cup a week until we decided who is the best based on different factors.
Yes.
Not just the football played, but also who was interesting, what was weird, why did they do it like that? And of course, with the World Cup, who was using it as fascist propaganda to prop up their failing regime? Because that is in so many of them.
It is. So what is likely to have happened, Paul, is that people will have joined the series when we start talking about World Cups so they can remember. And then if they like it, they will have gone back and started listening from the beginning. No one's listening to this when it goes out. They're going to listen to this after we've done like 1970, and then they've come back to this one. Yeah. But it's a shame because the 1930 World Cup is, I'm going to go out on a limb right now and say, the most bonkers of all the World Cups.
That is a big limb to go out onto.
Yes, I like my big limbs.
But yeah.
And there's a whole thing about limbs going to be coming up as well. I'll get this caveat out the way right now. When we say World Cup on this podcast, we are referring to the FIFA Men's World Cups. We know that many sports have World Cups, and football has many, many World Cups as well. Most notably, the FIFA Women's World Cup, which is now becoming a much more popular thing, which is great. But this isn't a podcast about them. So when we use World Cup, we're referring to the FIFA Men's World Cup. It's just shorthand. And also, we're massive sexists.
It's also when we say football, we are referring to association football and not rugby football, gridiron football, Aussie rules football, Gaelic football, and so on. Hopefully that has not offended any Australians or Gaelics. Don't mind if we offend Americans.
Before we get into 1930, though, we should set some context. The first international football match was in 1872 between England and Scotland. So in a mad way, that was the first World Cup, wasn't it? But it finished 0-0, as you would expect.
There were quite a lot of sort of mad first ones for lots of things. The first international Test cricket match was between the US and Canada.
And that also finished 0-0, which was controversial at the time. A lot of confused colonials just looking at the equipment going, what are we supposed to do with this? And then after 5 days, they just said, let's just call it a draw.
And that set the same for future ones.
So, Paul, I know you've been looking at the precursors to the World Cup.
In 1896, the Olympics was first done as a thing over in Athens.
Was first done as a thing?
Yeah.
Is that what they said at the time? Yeah, Welcome to the Olympics. It's the first time we've done this as a thing.
Well, of course, obviously there was the ancient Olympics and then there was the much Wenlock Olympics. But the first time the Olympics was done as a thing was in 1896, and then football was quite a big part of those tournaments, but were for amateurs because the 19th century was quite big into its amateurism as a concept, the Corinthian spirit of doing things like being from Corinth and being a book of the Bible. I really don't know how Corinth gets in it. I don't know.
It was just their attitude that basically, unless you were independently wealthy, you had no place doing anything fun.
Yeah.
Get back to the fields and make my dinner.
Yeah. Oh, you've come out of a factory and you want to play football. Well, fine, but as long as you don't want paying. So there were club sides, obviously existed for a fair few years at this point, and most of the amateur sides played in different tournaments. In the early 1900s, in 1909 and 1911, Thomas Lipton of tea fame set up the Thomas Lipton Trophy to see who was the best of the European teams. And actual proper teams from Italy played, and they were beaten by the team of amateurs from a mining village in the northeast, a team called West Auckland.
The northeast of England, we should clarify at that point.
Yeah, they played a Torino 11 that was a combined Juventus and Torino team.
Yes, I've often heard this say that was the real first World Cup. It's not, because it's club sides, not international sides.
No one was saying that West Auckland were the best team in England.
West Auckland winning that trophy sort of feeds into a recurring theme of this podcast, which is British arrogance.
Yeah. The various FAs of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have all wanted to not play football, despite the fact that is pretty much their job. They've got, playing football in a different place.
West Auckland still play. They're in the Northern League Division 1.
I wonder if that is still in their cabinet. Sort of like, here are the two original World Cups we won. And then this is when we won the Barrow in Furness Invitational Cup.
Yeah, they've got 2 cans of Lipton iced tea from the 1910s still in there. So FIFA, which had been formed in 1904, had done so with the agreement of all member nations that FIFA will be the only body who could organise an official World Championships. But it took until the 20s for there to be agreement for there to be one. And it was basically because for ages they were like, well, we've got the Olympics and that's fine. But the rise of professional footballers meant that the best players weren't getting to play in what was the de facto World Championships. So they decided they were going to do a World Cup. And they asked everyone to vote, do you want a World Cup or not? And they won the vote, which is why there is a World Cup. And they're going to do it in 1930. They ask who wants to be the host. And Sweden, who had voted against there being a World Cup, said, well, we don't want there to be one, but we will host it.
Yeah.
We don't want one, but we'll have it. So obviously FIFA told them to get knotted. And then, of course, you got the British nations who refused to take part.
Had they refused to join FIFA in the first place, or were they never asked?
No, they were in FIFA, and then they left FIFA in some row about professionalism and amateurism, which I can't really make head nor tail of, if I'm honest. It was just stupid spat. But also, the British FAs believed that the home nations tournament was actually the World Cup, which is a damn shame, because 1930 was the only World Cup to not have qualifying. FIFA just basically said, who wants to be in this? And then everyone who said yes got to be in it, which, I mean, Wales must have been absolutely kicking themselves that they didn't enter it.
Just come rock up. Say you're from a country that doesn't exist. No one's checking. Ruritania. Come on. Join the 30s World Cup.
Which brings us on to the first of our criteria from which all World Cups should be judged, and that is the host nation. FIFA chose as the hosts for 1930 Uruguay, a relatively obscure South American nation, you might think, but they were double Olympic champions at the time, having won in 1924 and 28.
Still puts their stars on their jersey to count those as World Cup wins, even to this day. Uruguay is a very interesting place.
You've been, haven't you, Paul?
I've been, yeah. When I was travelling, it was on my gap year when I had a mental breakdown when I was about 33. Highly recommend it. Absolutely football mad as a country. They built a whole stadium, the Stade Centenario.
That's a wonderful pronunciation you've got there.
Yes, it is.
Like a native would say.
Yeah.
They said, if you give us the World Cup, we will build a massive stadium for it.
Like Noah in an ark. Just like, we'll build this thing. And it's very cool. It's because it's built in the design in the late 20s into the 30s. It's all Art Deco and has got this massive totem pole at the end of a bowl stadium. It's very cool. It still exists, which is nice. And they have a museum of football and football things. And there's lots of caricatures of players of the time from artists of the time. Now, due to the fact that the teams were racially integrated, which is nice, it also means the caricatures are racially integrated, which is not nice, considering how people in the 30s decided to draw other people. So if you are ever there, I do recommend it as a thing, but do walk around going, bloody hell, you'd not get away with that in Daily Mail in the 70s.
Also, the stadium was not finished on time.
Of course it wasn't.
Of course it wasn't, but only a couple of weeks late, wasn't it?
Yeah. Any Olympics, any World Cup thing is always going to be held up by either massive corruption or massive infrastructure failings.
So they're going to have the World Cup in Uruguay, which is great, and all the South American nations jump at the chance to be part of it, as do the United States and Mexico. No European nations wanted to be part of it, though.
It's a long way away, isn't it?
Yes, which would have kind of undermined the whole world aspect of the World Cup. Bearing in mind that the Copa America was already a thing at this point.
Yeah, also the fact that there is no European Championship at this point and would not be for quite some time.
No, Europe was too busy having actual wars with each other to have football tournaments. Eventually, Uruguay say they're going to pay for teams to show up and everything. And it's like a 3-week boat ride that the European teams have to make. But make it they do. France, Yugoslavia, Romania and Belgium make the trip, all on the same boat.
Because insurance at this time was fine, isn't it?
It's 1930. There hasn't been a major sinking for all of 10 minutes. Also on the boat was Jules Rimet.
Ah, yes.
And his mate Henri Delaney. And the trophy. And a bunch of referees. And on the way, they picked up the Brazil team. All on the same boat.
Which is kind of mad because Brazil borders Uruguay. I mean, I know most of it is coast. It probably would have been easier, but yeah, I'm not taking a train to southern Brazil.
No, and in fact, all the Brazilian squad were from Rio de Janeiro, and it wasn't that they were the best. They were the ones nearest the boat when it showed up. So there are 13 teams then taking part in the first ever World Cup.
Which is, of course, a nice round number that can be split easily into divisible units.
They wanted 16 so they could have a straight knockout tournament. They went with groups in the end, 3 groups of 3 and 1 group of 4, because how else are you going to split up 13 teams? Well, what you could do is just have one massive 13-team league and everyone plays each other once, but that would take ages. I mean, if FIFA were doing that now, that is exactly what they'd do.
Or maybe not 2 leagues and then they don't play each other.
Well, if you really wanted to find out which was the best team on earth at that time, and it would involve making the British FAs get over themselves, would be to have a South American Championship and a European Championship and have the winners play each other.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't have a World Cup if they'd done that.
I'm glad that they didn't. What were the groups, James?
Well, this is very much World Cup format number 1. Group 1 was Argentina, Chile, France and Mexico. Group 2 was Yugoslavia, Brazil, Bolivia. Group 3, Uruguay, Romania and Peru. And Group 4, United States, Paraguay and Belgium. What grudge matches there leaping out at you?
All right, Argentina and Chile have definitely had a war. I think France and Mexico have definitely had a war. Like part of France was Mexico once?
Part of France was in Mexico once. What are you talking about?
Sorry. Louisiana Purchase was part of Mexico, maybe.
I think you're making this up.
Very possibly.
Yugoslavia, Brazil, Bolivia was Group 2.
Yeah, that'll be some great matches.
I mean, Yugoslavia went on to have a war with itself.
Bolivia is a very interesting place because it's lost so many wars that it's lost loads of chunks of land. But also, they have a day of the sea, considering they are now a landlocked country, where they're like, come on, Chile, give it back. Back our coastline, please. We'd like to put our navy on somewhere other than Lake Titicaca.
There were seeded teams in the draw. Do you know who the seeded teams were, Paul? The 4 seeded teams?
I'm going to say France and Brazil because of tradition, but I imagine it's probably something mad like Bolivia.
No, it wasn't. It was Uruguay for being the hosts. Argentina for being very much seen as the second best team because they were the ones who Uruguay had beaten in the Olympics. The United States and Brazil.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, which is bonkers because the United States had not played an international football game for 2 years leading into this tournament. If you think that's weird, Brazil had not played an international game for 5 years before this tournament, and yet they were down as the seeds.
I know in the 30s, there's stuff going on in the late 20s, what with the whole Wall Street crash and worldwide depression. But 5 years? What?
I know.
What?
It just smacks of laziness, if you ask me.
Yeah.
So you're thinking, wow, how do they get to be the seeds? Well, it turns out most of the other teams were no good. Mexico had only ever won one international match against Guatemala prior to this tournament. Bolivia had never won an international football match going into this tournament. It was literally, who wants to play in this World Cup? You can be in it.
Bolivia is a very poor country, and still, when I was there, they played World Cup qualifiers, I think it would have been, and they were playing Argentina, and they did a thing of the transfer fees. Even excluding Messi, the Argentinian team was worth 870 million, and the Bolivia team was worth 6.
They're classic underdogs, Bolivia, and in about 15 weeks' time, we will speak of them again with great fondness. So, the opening game of the first World Cup ever, or we should say opening games, because 2 of them took place at the same time. All the games, by the way, took place in Montevideo. So even though Uruguay is the host, it's really just the city of Montevideo. It's more akin to an Olympics than the World Cup as we know it.
Said that, Uruguay is tiny. I can't even think of what Uruguay's second city is, and I've been there.
There isn't one.
Fray Bentos is one of Uruguay's largest ports, and that's where you get pies from.
Also, the all-night garage is where I get pies from. Simultaneously, games going on. 2 games going on. In Group A, France play Mexico, and in Group...
When it said these games were played at the same time, I really hope they were played on overlapping pitches.
Sadly not. The USA-Belgium was the other game. Fun quiz, Paul. Which one do you think had the biggest attendance out of those 2?
France-Mexico. That's got to be bigger.
Nope. Only 4,500 people went to see that game. 18,000 went to see the US play Belgium. The United States won 3-0. The Belgian team were depleted. They were missing their influential striker and captain, the hilariously named Raymond Brain, who was suspended from international football by the Belgian FA. Do you know why he was suspended?
Right.
Have a guess. 1930 Belgium.
1930 Belgium. Had he become a communist?
No.
He got a sponsorship for pipe tobacco.
I mean, you're getting closer. He'd opened a cafe. The Belgian FA said the executive committee takes the decision that, except for a player whose parents ran the cafe for more than 5 years, the authorisation to open a cafe will be subordinated to the condition that the player will not be part of the first team. So he opened a cafe, and Belgium went, even though you're our best player, we will not pick you.
Against coffee or against being capitalism? Or did you just think that they got too many shift patterns on?
I think they thought he'll have to dash off to put the eggs on or something, and it's not worth it. So he wasn't playing for Belgium. So the United States won 3-0. I've got the United States squad list. Various members of the US squad played for teams such as the Providence Goldbugs, the New Bedford Whalers, who went on to team up with Bob Marley to such great success in later years. The Fall River Marksmen, the Lusitania Recreation. That's not a football team. That's just like a drama thing, isn't it?
Yeah. But also, the Lusitania was a ship that went down in, 1913? So they were just sort of like a Titanic reenactment society that got out of hand that ended up
ended up being a football team. The Detroit Holly Carburetor.
That's very funny because the basketball team, the Detroit Pistons, were originally called the Zollner Pistons because Fred Zollner, who owned a piston factory, went, "Yep, we've got all the work team." And I like the fact that there was so much work in Detroit in manufacturing. They were like, "Yeah, we've got a team just for carburetors."
Yeah, the Detroit Carburetors. And there was the Ben Millers, of course, where you had to be called Ben Miller to play and have a friend called Alexander Armstrong that you did funny sketches with. They were sponsored by the Ben Miller Hat Company of St. Louis That's why they were
I
called the Ben
really
Millers.
want them to come on to Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller, 65,000.
There was a team called the Glenn Millers, but during one game there was some fog and they disappeared and no one saw them again. Too soon? I would like a Ben Miller's football team replica shirt if anyone from Toffs is listening.
I'd like a Ben Miller hat. If anyone from the Ben Miller Hat Company is listening, I would like a top hat that is in your team colours.
That was the most popular opening game, the USA winning 3-0 there. In the other game was a game of firsts and lasts.
Ooh.
France 4, Mexico 1 was the final score. So that game included the first goal scored in a World Cup finals by Lucien Laurent of France. He scored the first goal.
If he was from anywhere else, you'd be like, you should be playing for France, mate. That is like, what is a good French name for a 30s French footballer? Lucien Laurent.
He only ever scored 2 goals for France, and that was one of them. In later years, he was a prisoner of war during World War II, and was...
He opened a cafe, hadn't he?
Yeah. He was the only survivor of this team to see France win a World Cup.
Oh.
In 1998. He lived to see that. He lived quite a while.
Yeah, that's impressive.
So he was the first goal scorer. And then something happened in the France-Mexico game, so like in the joint first game ever of the World Cup, that I don't think has happened in a World Cup game since. And if it turns out that it has happened, I will happily go back on this. But as far as I can tell...
You'll go back and eat a Ben Miller hat.
Yeah, exactly. It is the only game where a goalkeeper has been replaced by an outfield player.
Ooh, I like that. I like those spicy little bit moments. That was pre-substitutions as a concept.
Yeah. So the goalkeeper was injured, so they just had to put an outfield player in. Yeah. And it was the French team that happened to. And I think they were only like 2-0 up when it happened.
Yeah,
well.
I would like it when there's an outfield player has to go in goal. It's less likely these days due to the amount of subs and the amount of subs on the subs bench.
Yeah.
But there was always a thing of someone going in goal. It was
just shoot from everywhere.
And then like them being accidentally making a save is just so exciting.
The last one I can remember is Kyle Walker having to go in goal for the last 5 minutes of a Champions League group game for Manchester City a few years ago. Do you want to know the name of the French goalkeeper who was injured?
No. Yes, please.
You do want to know, because I think it's the funniest name at this World Cup.
That is one of the factors that we will be taking into it.
Yes, absolutely.
Who's got the funniest name of any weird player?
Alex Teapot.
That's not very French, is it?
It's teapot as in the French teapot, so it's the pot. It's spelled the pot, but it's teapot, isn't it? That's the French word for teapot. Alex Teapot, very controversial goalkeeping style as well, because he would have one hand on a hip and the other hand flapping around in the air.
Oh, Kyle Walker, because he played in goal, made himself the third highest transfer feed.
He's the third most expensive goalkeeper of all time.
Yeah.
Good fact.
You can tell sometimes that me and James both have worked running quizzes and writing them, because you just go, that's a little thing that will annoy Petty.
Augustin Chantrel was the player who went in goal, and it happened in the 24th minute when France were only 1-0 up and they went on to win 4-1. So he must have been pretty good. Or, as I probably suspect, Mexico were really quite bad at football.
And these Guatemalan hill farmers that we played last time to get our 1 win.
Also, in the French team, their captain, Alexandre Villaplan, 14 years later, he was shot by a firing squad for collaborating with the Nazis.
Ooh.
He was an absolute turncoat traitor, and they reckon his actions directly led to at least 10 murders while he was collaborating with the Nazis. So the French resistance shot him. That was the captain of the French football team.
Captain of the French team. When it all kicks off in a few years' time, just keep an eye out on whatever Laurent Blanc's up to at the moment.
So, keep an eye on them, just in case, if they're cozying up to Putin a bit much. As we go into the 34 and 38 World Cups, there's going to be a lot more stories of what players do in the war.
There is also a war that happened in the 30s where there's a team from Bolivia called The Strongest. And that's not the translation of what the name is. For some reason, this Spanish-speaking team in a Spanish-speaking country is called The Strongest. And they won a medal for all of them being in the same battalion during a war with, I think it's with Paraguay, but they had a big old war. But the entire first team.
A big old war.
Well, it's not going to be a small war, is it? Had all of the things for a war, guns and such. I don't know what your classification for what a small war would be, but they had an entire football team on the same battalion.
Hey, have you ever played a board game? You have? Then you'll love my book, 101 Board Games to Play Before You Die. I look at the board games that we've loved, hated, and thrown across the room in a fit of rage. I'll tell you which classic games are not worth the time and emotional torment, and which games you should be playing instead, as well as giving you advice on how to make your dinner parties more tolerable and how to pimp your Scrabble. The perfect gift for your nerdy friend, it's available from 101boardgames.com. That's 101boardgames.com. More firsts, of course, in the first World Cup. There's going to be a lot of firsts, and they mostly happen in Group 1. Argentina finally show up. The scheduling of the groups is all over the shop. You'd think, okay, France-Mexico, that's the first game. So the second game, that'll be the other two teams in the group, right? Argentina-Chile. No, it's Argentina against France. 2 days later. Knackered France, who've been on a boat for 3 weeks, are then forced to play another game against a really good team.
I would love to find out what they did for training on the boat. Or
they used to run around the deck.
Really? Just that?
Yeah, and do like sort of aerobics and things.
Any exercise from the past looks stupid. But I just love the idea of a load of French and Belgians going hop, hop, and doing calisthenics and throwing medicine balls at each other's stomachs and going hop, hop, yeah. One of those striped leotards and a boater.
Incredibly, though, in that second game, France did hold out for 81 minutes before Argentina broke them down and scored. A player called Luis Monti. More about him as things progressed. He was very much the star player of the Argentinian team. He was sort of a hard-tackling centre-half, a bit in the sort of Javier Mascherano mould. His nickname was Double Wide. It was because it was hard to get round him. I don't know if he was massive. I don't think it was because he was massive. Also, the Argentinian goalkeeper, Angel Luis Bocio, was known as the Elastic Wonder.
Oh, yes, please. Because this is all at the time of the first comic books as well. I can imagine that playing tonight on RCA Radio, sponsored by Lipton Iced Tea, the Elastic Wonder.
There were loads of nicknames in this World Cup. It's a thing that doesn't really happen anymore, and I'm sad about that. So
start calling Phil Foden the Blue Tack Marvel and then never explain it.
The Elastic Wonder and Double Wide playing for Argentina. France had Marcel Languile, who was nicknamed the Quail. Mexico.
He was eaten illegally in small cafes by people.
Yeah, probably Raymond Brain's cafe. Mexico has Raimundo Rodriguez, known as the Raccoon. Manuel Rosas, more of whom later. He was nicknamed the Jacket. In Yugoslavia, they had Momčilo Dokic, the Pirate. Đorđe Vujadinovic was known as the Flying Footballer. Fausto of Brazil was the Black Wonder.
He's already named Fausto. That's bloody good.
Jose Andrade, Leandro Andrade, the only black player in the Uruguayan team that won the World Cup, spoilers, was known as the Black Marvel. They also had Pedro Petroni, the artilleryman, Hector Beretta, the magician.
I would read a 1930s comic called Hector Beretta, the Magician. And he's just going around making tanks disappear.
And, of course, Carlos Martinez of Peru, who was nicknamed the Hose. I mean, the mind literally boggles.
Yeah. There's
we all know why he's called that.
For that. And it's maybe he showered in the street.
Yes, but also in the Argentina team, Francisco Varallo, and he's notable because he was the last surviving player from this World Cup. My question to you, Paul Savage, is when did he cark it?
So if the last surviving Frenchman to see the World Cup win was 1998, and you have to be at least 20 to play in 39. I'm going to say outside thing 2005.
He died on the 30th of August 2010, aged 100 years old.
Whoa! Good innings.
Incidentally, Jean Deby, the Belgian reserve goalkeeper, is the oldest player to ever be picked in a World Cup squad. He was born on the 9th of May, 1892. However, he didn't play. The oldest player to have played was the captain of Mexico, Rafael Garza Gutierrez, who was born on the 13th of December, 1896.
So he'd have been how old at the...
33 and a half.
He's the oldest one to play at any World Cup.
No one born before him ever played in a World Cup game.
Right, okay, yeah. Sorry, I thought it was like...
No, there have been older players.
There's been a 36-year-old at the World Cup.
No one was born before 1896. The youngest player at this World Cup was Carvalho Leite, Brazilian forward, who was 18. And he was the youngest World Cup player until Pelé shows up. Anyway, what were we talking about?
A lot of things that are... that was a record until Pelé showed up. And then it's a record forever.
Also, so some other firsts happening in Group 1. In the Chile-Mexico game is the first own goal.
Oh, disappointing. Who was it?
It's a player we've already mentioned. Manuel Rosas, the jacket. He scored the first own goal. But get this, in their very next game, he was the first player to score a penalty at the World Cup as well. Double first for Manuel. And he was the youngest scorer of a goal at the World Cup until Pelé shows up.
Penalty kicks were invented in Northern Ireland.
Is that so?
I'm only going from this there was a banner in the Northern Ireland end at one of the Euros. It was like, Northern Ireland originated the penalty kick 1910. So I don't know if that is true or if that banner lied to me. And Will Grigg is not on fire. Manuel
Rosas was the first player to score from a penalty kick. He wasn't the first player to take a penalty at the World Cup. That honour goes to Vidal of Chile in their 1-0 win over France, which was saved by Alex Teapot.
Yay!
He saved the first penalty. In fact, of the first 4 penalties at World Cups, 3 of them were saved. So they were bad at penalties in the old days.
England should have gone to this World Cup.
Yes, of course they should have. They should have just got over themselves and taken part. You know, they thought they were the best team in the world without ever having to prove it.
Yeah.
And it would have been a real test for that group of players.
Also, the Wales side of the 30s were very strong. They did win some of the home nation ones and were considered amongst the best in the world. And they never tested it against anyone. Because why would you?
It's all very well saying that, but you've got to go to Uruguay and prove it on a wet Wednesday. Or a snowy Wednesday. I should point out for the opening game, France versus Mexico, there was snow on the ground because, of course, July in Uruguay is the winter.
Now, that is something that I can consider would have played into France's hands more than Mexico's hands. I'm just going, what is this?
And then in Group 1, you get, which I think is the game of the tournament, which is Argentina 6, Mexico 3.
Whoa.
A 9-goal thriller, including the first international appearance by Guillermo Stabile, who would go on to be the top scorer in this World Cup, the first winner of the Golden Boot. So he didn't play in Argentina's opening game. He was their third choice striker. He only played against Mexico because their first choice striker, Roberto Cerro, had an anxiety attack in the France game.
Wow.
Which, by the way, the France game, the final whistle blew 6 minutes early while France were attacking at 1-0 down.
Oh.
The referee then admitted he'd made a mistake and made them come on for the last bit. So Cerro, he was out.
I wonder if the papers of the time were quite so awful about mental health as you'd imagine.
Yes.
Saying,
Their second choice centre forward, Ferreira, he was out because he was taking a law exam. So they put Stabile in for his debut, and he promptly goes and scores a hat-trick.
Oh.
There were also 3 penalties given in the game.
Now, how dubious do we reckon these were?
Probably incredibly dubious. Only one of them was scored by Rosas, who we mentioned. That was the first successful penalty. And the referee of the game was the coach of Bolivia.
Well, yes. Fascinating. Now, I would like to know if the man who was taking the law exam would go, wait a minute.
And the linesman was the coach of Romania. And that game finished 6-3.
Wow.
So I think we all know what happened there. I think there were 3 penalties, and it was bonkers. Even though we have no idea of knowing, I think that's the game of the tournament.
There's only still footage for most of these games due to the ravages of time.
It's a World Cup that only exists on paper. This World Cup. In fact, in 2014, the BBC did what they describe as in-depth documentary about the 1930 World Cup. It was 14 minutes long. There's just no footage.
There's still newspaper stills of goals where you can't tell whether it's going in or not because taking a photo was very expensive then. Nowadays, you just go and take 40,000.
People can't see you doing that mime. It's just so you know.
Yeah, but I did the noise.
Okay, you're doing that noise. That's fine.
You take 1 million and you flip through them. But in those days, it was made on you had to buy silver to look at things. So you were just like, nah, I'm not wasting my good silver on for it to get a photo.
So much of what you say sounds so made up, Paul. The final game of that group, Argentina beat Chile 3-1. Stabile scored another 2 goals, bringing his total up to 5 in 2 games. And then
is now my favourite player.
And that meant Argentina topped the group and were going through to the semi-final. Chile didn't play another international game for 5 years. After that,
was so pissed off.
In Group 2, Brazil were the seeds, but in the first game, Yugoslavia beat them.
Nice.
2-1. Yugoslavia then walloped Bolivia, who, as we all know, are terrible, 4-0. And then in the Brazil-Bolivia game, which was a dead rubber, Brazil won 4-0 anyway. Brazil and Bolivia showed up in the same kit, and they didn't change it until halfway through this first half.
Oh, amazing.
I know.
So either they didn't have away kits in those days, and so they had to send somebody off and just run around the corner and go to Montevideo FC, or...
What colour do you think both teams showed up in? It's Brazil, Bolivia, they're both wearing the same kit. Yep, they both wore blue. Yep, they did. Yeah. Brazil were wearing blue at that time. Hilariously, in the Yugoslavia-Bolivia game, Bolivia wore special shirts that had letters on them. Right? So each player had a giant letter on the front of their shirt, which, if they stood in the right order, spelt Viva Uruguay, in a blatant bit of pandering to the host nation. It's like, we are by far the worst team in this competition.
Yeah.
We need to do anything we can to try and curry favour with officials. So, it says Viva Uruguay on their shirts. That means at some point during the game, 5 Bolivians would have been standing in a row with shirts that said gravy. And thus becoming the first World Cup players to have gravy on their shirts until Paul Gascoigne, presumably. Yugoslavia, that was the shock. Yugoslavia beat Brazil. Even though Brazil hadn't played for 5 years, everyone thought, it's Brazil. But Yugoslavia beat them, so they got through to the
That's sort of interesting that Brazil were already at that point known as the greatest team ever.
Well, not the greatest team ever, but like a good team. It was assumed they would be good. In Group 3, you got the hosts, Uruguay. They win their 2 games without conceding a goal. What's noticeable about that group is the other game, the opening game of that group, Romania-Peru, which finished 3-1 to Romania, featured a goal after 50 seconds.
Whoa, record-breaking. That's going to be
from Romania.
Time, I imagine.
It also featured the first sending off, Galinda of Peru.
It was difficult to do.
Yeah.
You see some challenges that fly in well until the 70s where you're like, that is GBH. And they just
you basically had to pull out a gun and shoot someone to get sent off. Galinda of Peru, of course, who went on to be the Wicked Witch of the West, I think. He wasn't suspended because it's the 30s, we don't know what to do when someone gets sent off. Bearing in mind that Belgium suspended someone for opening a cafe. The notable thing about the Romania-Peru game at the Estadio Poquitos in Montevideo is it has the lowest attendance ever of any World Cup finals game.
Yeah, because the stadio was really poquito.
Yes.
In the stadium.
How many do you think?
Lowest ever, 555.
300 people.
Oh, I went to see this weekend Lewis Women in the second tier of women's football.
Lewis Women, isn't that on ITV at lunchtimes?
They really should sponsor them. That would be hilarious. They had 2,500, or no, maybe 4,500 people there. It was amazing. But that's easily outranking a World Cup game by factors of 15. 10 or...
So Uruguay win that group easily. In the Group 4 as well, the United States win their first 2 games 3-0. In the second game against Paraguay, I don't know how to pronounce this, so I'm going to guess. Bert Paternaud scores the first hat-trick, first World Cup hat-trick.
Oh, that's
scored
impressive.
By United States player. So they were through, and then the other game was a dead rubber. Paraguay beat Belgium 1-0. Straight to the semis. Argentina play the United States and Uruguay play Yugoslavia on consecutive days at the Estadio Centenario. Argentina against United States, by all reports, is a game where Argentina bully the United States.
Well, because the thing would have been, if they didn't have proper sporting teams, quite a lot of these would have been college players and sort of gentlemen amateurs. Argentina's would have been professional, and so they would have just been basically going around and wedging a load of Americans.
Jimmy Douglas, the American goalkeeper, twisted his knee 4 minutes into the semi-final, stayed on the pitch for the whole thing. Andy Auld, the wing half, was basically assaulted. He had his lip split by a kick to the mouth and had smelling salts thrown into his eyes.
So not smelling salts to get him over the...
Someone threw smelling salts in his eyes, apparently. He played the game with a rag in his mouth to stop the bleeding.
I play my game with a rag in my mouth.
Lewis Monty, he was one of the culprits.
Yeah,
he'll keep showing up. By the way,
it is amazing that we are 0 year for World Cup football, and Argentina are being shithouses. This
not
is
a stereotype.
Argentina style.
To be fair to Argentina, they do win 6-1.
So they didn't need to cheat, and yet they wanted to cheat.
Well, you say that 4 of the goals were in the last 10 minutes. Basically what happened was the United States just got knackered, and they were like the walking wounded by the end. Even though, by the way, their goal came in the last minute as well, their consolation goal. Stabile scored another 2, taking his total up to 7 in 3 games. World Cup semi-final, it's finished 6-1. When's that ever going to happen again? So anyway, the next day... Uruguay play Yugoslavia in a game that finishes 6-1 to Uruguay. Yugoslavia score first after 4 minutes, and after 9 minutes...
Guys, all you got to do is just keep this tight
keep it tight.
86 minutes. And,
After 9 minutes, Yugoslavia have a goal disallowed against the host nation in the semi-final.
Was it the Romanian coach again?
Also, the Uruguay's 3rd and 4th goals, which happened on either side of half-time, were contested. I have no further details. Obviously, there's no footage. We don't know. But basically, Yugoslavia got beat 6-1. They were absolutely furious about it. So much so that the rumour has it that the 3rd-place playoff game was cancelled.
Oh, because they were... So not happy about...
Apparently there was going to be one because there was one in the Olympics, and that's why they have 3rd-place playoffs in the World Cup. But Yugoslavia was so angry about how they'd been shoddily treated in the semi-final that they refused to play, so there was no 3rd-place playoff. So technically, the USA come 3rd by default. Yeah. Which brings us to British involvement.
This will be exciting because there is quite a lot of British involvement in early Argentine, Uruguayan, Brazilian football. That's why one of the best sides in Argentina, Newell's Old Boys, named after a British man who went over there. The entire concept of football was taken over by British merchants going over and being like,
"Hello, we've come to nick all of your things. But in return, here's a ball.
Here is silver. Thank you for that. We've stolen this from your mountains. Would you like to know about the Offside Trap?" And so there was quite a lot of early involvement in a lot of British coaches sort of ended up there. So I'm very interested in British involvement in the World Cup.
Yeah, none in the South American teams. It's the United States squad. The coach, Bob Millar, was from Paisley. Andy Auld, James Brown, not that one, Jimmy Gallagher, Bart McGee, and Alexander Wood of the USA squad were all from Scotland. And George Morehouse, the left back, was from Liverpool.
And all of them could have qualified to play for Ireland.
Indeed. George Morehouse, first English-born player to play in a World Cup in 1930. So basically, the United States team that finished 3rd by default in the 1930 World Cup is the most successful Scottish team in World Cup history.
Hello, I'm Paul Savage. As well as being the co-host of the World Cup of World Cups, I am a stand-up comedian. I'm doing a show called Well Groomed at the Canonsgate during the month of August from the 6th to the 28th, not the 17th, at 4:30 every day. A fun, silly show about trauma. And I am also a cartoonist. I have a book called But Doctor. I am a collection of comic strips by Paul Savage, and it is available through my website, savagecomic.com, along with mugs, stickers, postcards, and other fun stuff. Please check those out.
Which brings us on to the final, Uruguay versus Argentina. Now, the big decision the referee had to make before the game was what ball were they going to play it with?
You'd imagine The normal one. The normal one.
There was no such thing as a normal ball. Uruguay had a ball that they wanted to play with, and Argentina had a ball that they wanted to play with. So what the referee did was he said, we'll play with the Argentina one in the first half and the Uruguay one in the second half.
I was going to suggest that as the maddest idea possible of just playing 45 minutes with each, but they did that.
Yes, they absolutely did that with the wisdom of Solomon. And that's got me thinking, if they were doing that in 1966, would Jeff Hurst got to have kept both balls?
Yeah.
And what if it went to extra time? Whose ball would you play with then? Anyway, that was all moot because the game was over in 90 minutes and no one scored a hat-trick. If it was me and my team was in that position, I would play with the other team's ball in the first half. And I would say to the players, go hell for leather for 45 minutes. There is no second half. We win this half, all right? You win the first half with the opponent's ball, and then the second half, you bring one of those balls you get from caravan sites, the plastic ones, that when you toe poke it in the air, it just goes for a mile. And we're playing with this in the second half, and you just hold on to your lead. But they played with the Argentina ball in the first half, and Argentina won with that ball 2-1. Well done, Argentina. Unfortunately, the game doesn't end there. Uruguay go on to win 4-2.
I mean, we probably don't have the information. What was the difference in the balls? Of just like one being much more medicine ball-like, one made with softer leather?
There's a picture of them on Wikipedia. From what I can see, they're both really old because this picture was taken of them in the museum, I think, that's in Montevideo. I mean, it's the most childish thing ever, but I'm delighted that happened. There was controversy before the game as well, by the way. Remember Luis Monti?
Yeah.
Argentina's star centre-half. He got death threats before the game.
Yeah, and the thing is that Argentina borders Uruguay, so those are easily, doable. You can go over and you can take a train. So did Luis Monti play in that, or did he...
He did, but by all reports, he did not play very well.
So
he was off his game.
The one player who had an anxiety attack that was so strong it kept him out of it wasn't the guy who was getting death threats.
Yeah, Chero never got back in the team after that. Because you got Stabile and he scored 7 goals. He also scores in the final, bringing his total to 8 goals in 4 games over 11 days to be the first ever top scorer at the World Cup. And then he went on to never play for Argentina again. His entire international career lasted 11 days, in which he scored 8 goals in 4 games.
And won the Golden Boot and got to a final.
Yeah.
Bloody hell.
He scored the winning goal in the World Cup final with the Argentina ball.
You'd imagine that he, therefore, did something absolutely horrific to never play again. Either a horrific injury that curtailed his career and was never able to play, or that he said or did something absolutely horrific. Do we have any information about what it is?
Are we saying that Stabile was the victim of cancel culture?
People throwing smelling salts in people's eyes, and that's not enough to get you taken out of the team, but you'll score 8 goals in 4 games, and that's not enough to keep you in. You have to imagine that he did something pretty horrific.
He did, actually. He moved to Genoa. He went on to play for Genoa and Napoli and Red Star Paris.
Well, to be fair, if you're like, we're going to call you up for international duty, you've got to be on a boat for 6 weeks. I can imagine that's why he never played again.
Yeah. He did manage Argentina.
Nice.
For 20 years.
Oh, good. It's nice there's a happy ending of a player that played in the 30s.
Yeah.
And it's not. And the happy ending is he was shot by the Nazis. For helping them.
Basically, he retired in 1939, came back to Argentina and became the coach. And then the Second World War happened. But he was the coach until 1960 of the Argentinian team. That was the top scorer, Stabile. Uruguay, they win. They win the World Cup.
Campione del Mundo.
Masterminded by their manager, Alberto Supici, nicknamed the Professor.
If you're going to have a name for a manager, that is the name that you want.
El Professor. What are you picturing in your mind's eye there?
I am picturing a small man, a little pair of those glasses, what they call pince-nez, the ones that don't have...
Okay,
those ones, little round spectacles, a little bit balding. Basically, I'm going somewhere between Sven-Göran Eriksson and Mr. Burns from The Simpsons.
All right. So give me a rough age.
He's 65.
Yeah, he was 31. He's the youngest coach of a World Cup winning team, El Professor.
And that's never going to be beaten, by the way. That was just like, I don't care. You can cancel me if you listen to this in 2090, but I'm saying that will never be beaten.
We mentioned Jose Leandro Andrade, the only black player in the Uruguayan team, the Black Marvel. Here's some things that might be true about him.
Ooh.
Because from research, apparently, when he was born, his dad was 98 years old.
That is
it's possible. Sure. He was also...
I would love it if his dad was a 98-year-old white man who was like, and it's your son.
Jose was also a carnival musician who could play the drums, violin, and tambourine, which is like anyone could play the tambourine, mate. Don't shout about that.
Hopefully those are at the same time in like a one-man band thing.
Yes, I hope so too. And that would explain why he died age 55, penniless and alcoholic in an asylum. Not all these stories have happy endings. It's not how life works.
He got to play at a World Cup.
There was a last-minute goal in the final, scored by Hector Castro of Uruguay, who was nicknamed El Manco, which means the maimed, because he had amputated his right forearm with an electric saw when he was 13. So he only had one hand. And if you watch the footage that's on YouTube of the final, that last goal, you can clearly see he only has one hand.
That's impressive. I mean, it's impressive that he went on to reach such heights. It's also impressive how absolutely not allowed that nickname is.
The maimed.
The maimed? Yeah. Which one's he? Our number 11? Which one is he? Is it the maimed one? The crippled boy? There are certain countries around the world, and Uruguay is one of them, having been there, where they will just tell you that you're fat to your face. As though it's entirely possible that just calling him the maimed to his face was just standard.
It's just what they did. So Uruguay win the World Cup. The World Cup is not presented to the captain, Nasadze. Instead, it's given to the head of the Uruguayan FA.
Classic, in his blazer, just popping up. So did Jules Rimet have the Jules Rimet trophy at this point?
Yeah.
So
it came over on the boat with him.
Yeah, but was it called the Jules Rimet trophy at that point? Hello, I'm Jules Rimet. I'm giving you the Jules Rimet.
At that time, it was just called Victory. It was renamed in 1946 to honour Jules Rimet. Who is the figure on the Jules Rimet trophy?
Julie Rimet, his wife.
No, it's Nike, the Greek goddess of victory.
I thought you meant that, but who is the woman based on? Because obviously we don't know what Nike looked like.
Well, she had her arms up and she was holding a big cup.
Doing a big swoosh.
After the final, the Uruguayan consulate in Buenos Aires was pelted with stones, which is standard, and the referee from the game had to be guaranteed safe passage to his boat, which he immediately had to be put on.
It's nice to see that Argentina have started as they may continue. It's nice when you hear things of like, in the past, they had manners and they treated people properly and they knew it was just a game. No, immediately. Death threats. It's nice that we carry that on.
Things were not better in the old days just because it was old. And that's more or less the story of the 1930 World Cup. Just as a little postscript, Alfred Eisenbesser, midfielder, played for Romania. He was also an Olympic figure skater, by the way. On the boat back...
I bet he has calves like, whoa.
Yeah. Why? Stop getting excited about footballers of the 1930s. On the boat back, he caught pneumonia. So when the boat got back to Italy, he was put in a hospital and then the boat just left to drop everyone off in different places. The Romanian players just assumed he'd died. So they told his family that he died. And in fact, his mother was preparing his funeral when he showed up. He was like, I'm fine. He lived for another 61 years.
Oh, that's lovely. A nice ending. The horrible thing of his mum was preparing his funeral, he turned up, and then she died of shock.
Yeah. Or she was like, I've spent a bloody fortune on this funeral and shot him.
You're having it now.
All right, so now it's time to give our scores for the 1930 World Cup in various categories. The first category is host. What would you give out of 10 Uruguay for hosting the World Cup? Bearing in mind that they paid for countries to go there and they built a massive stadium, although it wasn't exactly ready on time.
It's still a beautiful looking stadium. It's not a white elephant. And Uruguayans generally were pretty cool when I went there. So I'm going to give them a good solid 8.
An 8 for hosting? Yeah, I'm going to give them 7 just for being a long way away. The next category is innovations. So that includes things like rule changes and the format.
It was very innovative to have weird groups.
Asymmetrical group phase. Yeah. Is that good, though? It's not fair, is it?
I think they were very innovative in lots of things like you can play with 2 different balls.
Yeah.
It's just not that any of these innovations are good. It's like, it was very innovative to make cancer airborne, but it's a bad thing.
Okay.
So, are we saying just any innovation change is good?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's the first World Cup. You've got to score it highly for that innovation alone. I'm going to give it
a nice solid 8.
I'm giving it a 9. Controversy.
Loads of controversy. I'm going to say with stuff like pelting consulates and roughhousing Americans and throwing smelling salts in the eyes. I'm going to say at least a 9 there.
Yes, I'm going to say 9 as well. Shocks.
America winning.
They were a good team and they were a seed and they got to the semi-final and then they lost, which is what everyone expected them to do.
Uruguay winning, that is kind of expected.
Argentina getting to the final was expected. The only one, they didn't think Yugoslavia would beat Brazil. That's literally the only shock, and actually that shock makes perfect sense.
I'd say 4 then.
I'm going to give it 1.
Oh, right, okay.
1. I'm being really harsh. No, not enough shocks. Game of the tournament. I think it's Argentina 6, Mexico 3.
Yeah.
It was also the first of a billion meetings between Argentina and Mexico at World Cups. They keep playing each other. What would you give that? I mean, we don't know because we can't see anything. All we know is the stories, but it sounds bonkers. I'm going to give it 8.
6-3 sounds great. I think that's a 7 at least.
Goal of the tournament.
Well, I'll now watch the one that is on the...
I can't see if all the goals from the final are in the official FIFA video that's on YouTube, and I can't tell which team's which because they both look exactly the same.
There's a thing on YouTube that says Todos los goles del Mundial Uruguay 1930, and it's got some diagrams that are drawn to show over the still pictures.
I'm going to say that the goal of the tournament was the last goal in the tournament, which is the Uruguay's 4th goal scored by Castro, who had one hand, because he had one hand, and he scored a goal. But we don't know if it was a good goal, so I can only give it 5, I think.
Oh, no, there's one where it goes in off the post for Stabile. That's a nice goal. Like, cuts inside, takes the keeper the other way. Yeah. Goal of the tournament.
So what are you scoring that?
People, it's a 5.
We're going to rate the final out of 10. It was 4-2. It's one of 4 World Cups to finish 4-2. It is the most popular scoreline in World Cup finals.
Amazing.
There are 3 2-1s and 3 1-0s. And the final, Argentina were winning with their ball, and then Uruguay came from behind to win 4-2. So
it sounds like a great game. I will give that an 8.
Yeah, I'll give it an 8 as well. The worthiness of the champions, Uruguay. Were they worthy champions?
They sounded like worthy champions. It's always easier on your home turf, but they sounded like, apart from the shithousery against the Yugoslavs.
We don't know, though. There's no evidence.
So I will say that they were reasonably worthy and give them an 8. Little asterisk of we don't know what happened in that game to put off referees to give disallowed goals and such.
I'm going to give them a 7. I mean, it was between them and Argentina. For the looks of things, the 2 best teams there, and they played each other in the final, and then Uruguay won. But they were at home. They played 4, won 4, scored 15, conceded 3. We're going to rate the top scorer out of 10. That's Stabile.
Yeah, I'm going to give him 8.
I'm going to give him 9 because he scored 8, which is really hard to do in a World Cup, even in those old days. I think all true top scorers of World Cups, it should be the highlight of their career. And for him, it was literally the only thing he did on the international stage.
Yeah. So I think he comes back to be manager for 20 years. So I'm very happy with that, yeah.
We're going to rate, because we're nothing if not parochial, the British contribution.
I'm really happy with the one Scouse lad who got a 3rd place medal.
Yeah, the Scottish coach and I think 6 Scottish players in the US squad. And also, I think the main British contribution was not showing up and letting other teams have a go.
Yeah, because that's nice, wasn't it? So I would say British contribution there is a 3.
Yeah, I'm going to say 2. Wider cultural impact.
It would be pre-cricket, rugby, any other World Cups in any other sport that I could think of. So I would say that that's a cultural impact that's every 4 years. I would say that's quite a wide cultural impact.
I'd say they've nicked that from the Olympics.
Yes, I would.
Yeah, I think, it was the first World Cup, but that's not a wider cultural impact. There is actually a Serbian film about the Yugoslavian team that got to the semi-finals. It's called See You in Montevideo.
Yeah.
But other than that, there's because of when it was and where it was, there's no footage. We don't know anything about it. I knew nothing about it until I started researching it for this. So I'm going to say 2.
Yeah, I would agree with you there.
Finally, entertainment value.
Well, there's the 14-minute video that is a lot of still images that's on YouTube, and this podcast.
Of the World Cup itself. I mean, it's incredibly hard to judge.
It sounds great. I mean, honestly, if I had a time machine, I'd go watch a few of these games. They sound great.
Yeah, I reckon the 300 people at Romania-Peru were all time travellers.
Yeah.
I think that's probably what happened there. I can give you some stats. There were 3.89 goals per game.
That's good standard.
Which is the 5th best in World Cup history. There were no 0-0s. There were 4 1-0s, but there were 2 dead rubbers out of 17 games, which is the highest percentage of dead rubbers.
But that is going to happen in a 3-team group, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of the time it will, which is why the plans for 2026 are stupid. So, what do you think entertainment value? I'm gonna say 7.
Yeah, I'll give it a 6 because we can't know.
No, I mean with a lot of the early ones, we are just whistling in the dark. The score then for the 1930 World Cup in Uruguay is 6.25.
No, an average of 6.65. A very good score for our opening candidate, the World Cup of Uruguay in 1930.
If there had been more footage, I think that would have shot up. Yes, that's our first one done. We will return in the next episode when we will be talking about 1934 in Italy, when FIFA decided to give the World Cup to an oppressive authoritarian regime.
But luckily, that's never happened since.
Before we go, I've got a teaser question that I'm going to set. It's just for fun, and I'll reveal the answer at the start of next week's podcast. And the trivia question...
Fun. I can offer prizes if they want. I've got a load of tat that I need to get rid of.
No, this is not an excuse for you just to declutter your house. It's just for fun. All right, so Uruguay won the World Cup by winning their first 4 games. Who were the only 2 teams in the 2018 World Cup to do that? Answer will be at the start of the next podcast, but to be honest, that's a really easy one to look up, isn't it? So you've got no excuse. I've been James Cook.
I've been Paul Savage.
Until next time, this has been the World Cup of World Cups. Ta-ra! You have been listening to the World Cup of World Cups podcast, hosted by me, James Cook, and Paul Savage. If you have any specific World Cup memories that you want us to talk about in future episodes, you can email us at worldcupofworldcups@gmail.com. Do get in touch with any questions, queries, comments and corrections you might have. And if you want to help the podcast out, there's a couple of ways you can do that. First of all, tell other people about it. We're an independent podcast and we rely on word of mouth. So please tell others that you think would be into this kind of thing. And if you want to help us financially, because at the moment we're making a loss on this, which we don't mind because it's a bit of a passion project anyway, but you can help at our Ko-fi page. That's ko-fi.com. Ko-fi.com/World Cup of World Cup podcasts. Basically, you can bung us the cost of a cup of coffee, although actually I prefer peppermint tea and Paul likes hot chocolate. But never mind, we're not spending it on hot drinks anyway, we're spending it on putting the podcast out. Any help you could give us would be greatly appreciated. In the next episode, we go to Italy in 1934 for a World Cup that was allegedly rigged. We'll also find out which squad featured an accordion player and a Nazi paediatrician, and tell you which Italian stadium gives you the best chance of seeing alien life. That's all in the next World Cup of World Cups podcast.
Stand and drink a toast once again. Let every loyal Maine man